The smoke still rises from the ruins of the greatest city in Greece. Athens, the jewel of Hellas, lies in absolute devastation. Her temples are blackened husks, her streets run with ash. The Acropolis, the sacred heart of Athenian civilization, has been put to the torch not once, but twice, by the fury of the Persian Empire. This is late summer of 479 BC, and the war that has consumed Greece for over a year is entering its final, most desperate phase. But on this day, on opposite sides of the Aegean Sea, two Greek armies are about to deliver a blow so devastating, so perfectly synchronized, that it will echo through the centuries as one of the greatest military achievements in human history. On the plains of Boeotia, a Spartan general named Pausanias is preparing to face the largest Persian army ever assembled on European soil. And across the wine-dark sea, a Spartan king named Leotychidas is leading a fleet of Greek warships toward the shores of Asia Minor itself, hunting the remnants of the Persian navy like wolves closing in on wounded prey. This is the story of the Battle of Mycale, the battle that history almost forgot, the twin victory that shattered an empire, the day the Greeks stopped defending and started their revenge. If you want to witness the most brutal and decisive moments in military history, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Wars in History. We bring you the battles that changed the world, told the way they actually happened. Now, let's go back to the ashes of Athens and see how this final confrontation began. To understand the Battle of Mycale, you must first understand the nightmare that Greece had become. It is the autumn of 479 BC, nearly a full year after the naval triumph at Salamis. That victory, won in the narrow straits between Salamis Island and the Attic coast, had shattered the Persian fleet and forced King Xerxes himself to abandon his dreams of conquest and flee back to Asia. The Greeks had celebrated. They had believed the war was over. They were wrong. Xerxes may have retreated, but he left behind something far more terrifying than his navy. He left behind an army. Not just any army, but a massive force under the command of Mardonius, one of Persia's most experienced and ruthless generals, perhaps 70,000 to 120,000 men, depending on the source and how they are counted. Mardonius was Xerxes' brother-in-law, a veteran of the first Persian invasion of Greece over a decade earlier, and a man with a personal stake in conquering the Greeks. He had spent the winter of 480 BC in Thessaly and the pro-Persian city of Thebes, consolidating his forces, securing alliances with Greek cities who had sided with Persia, and preparing for the final subjugation of Greece. The situation was beyond desperate. The Persian army controlled everything north of the Isthmus of Corinth. The Spartans and their Peloponnesian allies cowered behind their defensive wall at the isthmus, unwilling to risk their soldiers in open battle. And Athens, the city that had defied Xerxes, the city whose navy had won at Salamis, lay in complete and utter ruin. The destruction of Athens is one of the most brutal acts of vengeance in ancient warfare. When the Persians first entered the city in September of 480 BC, they found it nearly abandoned. The Athenians, guided by the strategic genius of their leader Themistocles, had evacuated their entire population to the island of Salamis and the nearby city of Troezen. Only a handful of defenders remained on the Acropolis, the sacred hill that held the city's most ancient temples. The Persians slaughtered them to the last man. Then, on the direct orders of Xerxes, they set the city ablaze. The temples burned, the houses burned. The older Parthenon, the sacred temple of Athena that had stood for generations, was reduced to rubble and ash. But that was only the first destruction. In the summer of 479 BC, Mardonius tried one final gambit to break Greek resistance. he sent envoys to Athens with an offer. Recognize Persian rule, accept Mardonius as your overlord, and Athens would be rebuilt with Persian gold. The city would be restored to its former glory. The alternative was annihilation. The Athenians, even as refugees living in tents and ruins, rejected the offer with contempt. So Mardonius marched his army south, reoccupied Athens for a second time, and burned what little remained. By the time he withdrew back to Boeotia to prepare for battle, Athens was no longer a city. It was a graveyard of marble and dreams. This is the world of 479 BC, a world where the greatest civilization in Greece has been erased from the map. A world where a Persian general sits in Thebes with an army large enough to crush any Greek force that dares face him. A world where the Spartans, the legendary warriors of Greece, refused to leave the safety of the Peloponnese. And yet, this is also the world where the Greeks are about to launch not one, but two offensives that will change the course of history. The Greek strategy in 479 BC was born from desperation and rage. The Athenians, homeless and furious, pressured the Spartans with an ultimatum: either march out and fight Mardonius, or Athens would make peace with Persia and turn their fleet over to the enemy. It was a bluff, but it worked. The Spartans finally agreed to send their army north under the command of Pausanias, the regent for the young son of Leonidas, the hero king who had died at Thermopylae. Pausanias was young, untested, and about to lead the largest Greek army ever assembled into a confrontation with the most powerful land force Persia had ever deployed in Europe. But the land war was only half the story. While Pausanias marched toward Boeotia, another force was preparing for an equally audacious gamble. The Greek fleet, rebuilt and reinforced after Salamis, was gathering under the command of King Leotychidas of Sparta. Leonidas' co-ruler, Leotychidas, was no warrior king destined to die gloriously in battle. He was a strategist, a politician, and a man who understood that wars were won not just on land, but on the sea. The mission of the Greek fleet was both simple and insane: cross the Aegean Sea, hunt down the remnants of the Persian navy, and liberate the Greek cities of Ionia from Persian control. These were the cities on the coast of Asia Minor, the Greeks who'd been living under Persian rule for decades. They had tried to rebel once before, in the Ionian revolt of 499 BC, and the Persians had crushed them with brutal reprisals. Now, 20 years later, the Greeks of the mainland were coming to finish what the Ionians had started. The Persian fleet, battered and demoralized after Salamis, had retreated to the safety of the eastern Aegean. They spent the winter of 480 BC at Syme, on the mainland, and on the island of Samos. By the spring of 479 BC, the fleet had consolidated at Samos, where they waited under the protection of a Persian land force. The Persian admirals knew their ships were outnumbered and their crews were terrified of another engagement with the Greeks. So they made a fateful decision. They would beach their fleet on the shores of Asia Minor below Mount Mycale, build a massive wooden stockade around the ships, and force the Greeks to fight a land battle if they wanted to destroy the Persian navy. It was a defensive strategy born from fear, and it would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. As the summer of 479 BC arrived, Greece stood on the edge of a knife. 2 fronts, 2 armies, 2 battles that would determine whether Greece would remain free or fall under the shadow of Persia forever. On the plains of Boeotia, Pausanias and his army were marching toward the Persian camp near the city of Plataea. And across the Aegean, Leotychidas and the Greek fleet were sailing from Aegina to Delos, gathering intelligence, preparing for the moment when they would strike at the heart of Persian naval power. Neither army knew what the other was doing. communication across the Aegean was nearly impossible, and yet, by an accident of fate, by a coincidence so perfect that the ancient Greeks believed it could only be the will of the gods, both battles would occur on the exact same day. The Battle of Plataea and the Battle of Mycale, the twin victories, the day Greece took its revenge. The Greek fleet had been gathering strength since the autumn of 480 BC, but it was not until the spring of 479 BC that King Leotychidas took command and began the campaign that would lead to Mycale. Leotychidas was an unusual choice to lead such a critical mission. Unlike Leonidas, who had embodied the Spartan ideal of the warrior king, Leotychidas was a survivor, a politician who had maneuvered his way to the throne through legal challenges and backroom deals. But he was also a man who understood naval warfare better than most Spartans, and he knew that the key to ending the Persian threat was not just defending Greece but taking the war to the enemy. The fleet that assembled under his command was a shadow of the armada that had fought at Salamis. Only 110 Greek warships gathered at Aegina, the island just off the coast of Athens. The Athenian contingent was smaller than before because many of their ships were being held back as a bargaining chip in the negotiations over the land campaign. The other Greek city-states contributed what they could, but the fleet was still badly outnumbered by the Persian navy, which had spent the winter rebuilding and regrouping. Yet Leotychidas knew something the Persians did not. He knew that morale, not numbers, would decide the war at sea. The first move came from the Greeks of Ionia themselves. In the spring of 479 BC, a delegation from the island of Chios arrived at Aegina with a desperate plea. The Ionians were ready to revolt against Persian rule, but they needed the support of the mainland Greek fleet. If Leotychidas would bring his ships across the Aegean, the Ionian cities would rise up and join the fight. It was a tempting offer, but Leotychidas was cautious. The Aegean was still dominated by the Persian fleet, and sailing into enemy waters without knowing the enemy's position was a gamble that could end in disaster. So instead of crossing the Aegean immediately, Leotychidas moved his fleet south to Delos, the sacred island at the heart of the Cyclades. Delos was neutral ground, a place where the Greeks could gather intelligence and wait for the right moment to strike. It was here, on Delos, that the fleet gathered its final strength. Athenian ships joined the expedition, and the allied force settled at roughly a little over 100 triremes, enough, Leotychidas believed, to win with morale and discipline rather than raw numbers. At the same time, across the narrow strait on the island of Samos, the Persian fleet was falling apart. The Persian admirals had lost their nerve after Salamis. They had watched their ships burn in the straits, seen their crews drown by the thousands, and felt the crushing weight of Greek naval superiority. Now, trapped on Samos with a demoralized force, and no clear orders from Xerxes, they made the decision that would seal their fate. They would not fight the Greeks at sea. Instead, they would beach their entire fleet on the coast of Asia Minor, near the slopes of Mount Mycale, and build a fortified camp around the ships. If the Greeks wanted to destroy the Persian navy, they would have to come ashore and fight a land battle. It was a desperate plan, but it had a certain logic. The Persian army detachment stationed near Mycale numbered around 60,000 men, a force large enough to hold a fortified position against a Greek landing force. The ships themselves would be protected by a massive wooden stockade, a wall of logs and timbers that would turn the beach into a fortress. The Persians believed that the Greeks, who excelled in naval combat but were vulnerable on land, would not dare attempt an amphibious assault. They were wrong. The news of the Persian withdrawal reached Leotychidas on Delos just as a second delegation arrived from Samos. 3 Samian exiles, including a man named Hegesistratus, brought word that the time was right to strike. The Persian fleet was vulnerable, the Ionian Greeks were ready to rebel, and the Persian soldiers guarding the camp were terrified and demoralized. Xanthippus spoke with the passion of a man who had lost everything to Persian rule and saw this as his one chance for liberation. He told Leotychidas that the Persians would not even fight, that they would break and run at the first sign of a Greek assault. And even if they did fight, he promised, the Ionians serving in the Persian army would turn on their masters the moment the battle began. Leotychidas listened to these promises, weighed the risks, and made his decision. The Greek fleet would sail for Samos. They would hunt down the Persian navy, and they would force the decisive battle that would end Persian power in the Aegean once and for all. The fleet set sail from Delos in the late summer of 479 BC, moving east across the Aegean toward the coast of Asia Minor. As the Greek ships approached Samos, the Persian lookouts on the island spotted the sails on the horizon, and panic erupted in the Persian camp. The Persian admirals held a hasty council of war. Some argued for launching the fleet and meeting the Greeks at sea, but that idea was quickly dismissed. The crews were too frightened, too broken by the memory of Salamis. Others suggested abandoning the camp and retreating inland, but that would mean abandoning the fleet entirely and admitting total defeat. In the end, the Persians chose to stand and fight behind their wooden walls, trusting in their fortifications and their numerical superiority on land. As the Greek fleet sailed along the southern coast of Samos toward the town, the Persians made their final preparations. They pulled their ships higher onto the beach, reinforced the stockade, and positioned their infantry in defensive lines behind the walls. The Persian commanders sent word to the Ionian Greek soldiers in their ranks, warning them that any sign of treachery would be met with immediate execution. They knew that the loyalty of the Ionians was fragile, that these Greek soldiers might turn on them the moment the battle began. But they had no choice. They needed every man they could get. And then the Greeks arrived. The fleet rounded the southern tip of Samos and came into full view of the Persian camp. The sight that greeted them was both impressive and terrifying. Hundreds of Persian ships lined the beach, their hulls pulled up onto the sand and surrounded by a massive wooden wall. Behind the wall, thousands of Persian soldiers waited in formation, their spears glinting in the summer sun. The Greek sailors could see the banners of the Persian Empire fluttering in the breeze, the same banners that had flown over the ruins of Athens. And for a moment, the Greeks hesitated. But Leotychidas was not a man who hesitated for long. He knew that the Greeks had come too far to turn back now. He knew that the land battle at Plataea was likely already underway, that Pausanias and the Greek army were fighting for the survival of Greece on the plains of Boeotia. And he knew that the men under his command were not just fighting for their own freedom, but for the freedom of every Greek city that had been crushed under the Persian boot. So he gave the order that would change history. The fleet would land, the marines would disembark, and the Greeks would storm the Persian fortress no matter the cost. As the Greek ships ran up onto the beach and the marines began to pour ashore, a strange thing happened. A rumour began to spread through the Greek ranks, a whisper that passed from man to man with the speed of wildfire. The rumour said that the Greeks had already won a great victory at Plataea, that Pausanias had shattered Mardonius and his army, that the Persian threat to mainland Greece was over. No one knew where the rumour came from. No messenger had arrived from Greece. There was no possible way that news could have travelled across the Aegean in time. And yet, every Greek soldier believed it. They believed it because they needed to believe it. Because the idea that both battles would be won on the same day felt like a sign from the gods themselves. The Greeks formed up on the beach below Mount Mycale, their bronze armour gleaming, their shields locked in the phalanx formation that had made them the masters of infantry combat. Leotychidas walked among them, shouting encouragement, reminding them that they were fighting not just for Greece, but for the Ionians who had been enslaved for decades. And then, with a roar that echoed across the water, the Greek army charged. The battle for Mycale had begun, and across the Aegean, on the plains of Boeotia, another army of Greeks was slamming into the Persian lines at Plataea. 2 fronts, 2 battles, 1 day, the day Greece took its revenge. The spring of 479 BC had seen both sides preparing for the final confrontation. In Thebes, Mardonius gathered his massive army and consolidated his control over northern Greece. He had spent the winter months recruiting Greek allies, bribing Greek cities, and building a coalition of Greek states who believed that Persian victory was inevitable. The Thebans, bitter rivals of Athens, had thrown their full support behind the Persian cause. They offered Mardonius their cavalry, their hoplites, and their intimate knowledge of Boeotian geography. It was a collaboration born from hatred, and it would make Thebes a target for Greek vengeance for generations to come. But Mardonius also faced a problem that was slowly eating away at his strategic position. His army was enormous. Tens of thousands of men need to eat. They need water. They need constant supply lines stretching all the way back to Thessaly and beyond. Every day that Mardonius waited in Thebes was another day that his supplies dwindled and his soldiers grew restless. He needed to force the Greeks into battle, to crush them before his own army collapsed under its own weight. So he made one final attempt at psychological warfare. He sent envoys to Athens with an offer so generous that many Greeks thought the Athenians might actually accept it. The offer was simple and devastating. Athens would be rebuilt with Persian gold. The Athenians would be given autonomy, allowed to govern themselves as long as they acknowledged Persian overlordship. All the lands they had lost, all the treasures stolen by the Persians would be returned. The temples would rise again from the ashes. The city would be restored to its former glory. All the Athenians had to do was abandon the Greek alliance and accept Mardonius as their ruler. It was the kind of offer that could split the Greek coalition apart. If Athens accepted, the Spartans would be isolated and the war would be over. The Athenian response was delivered by their leader Aristides, the man they called the Just. He told the Persian envoys that as long as the sun rose in the east, Athens would never make peace with Persia. The Athenians would rather die as free men than live as Persian subjects. And then he made his own demand. If the Spartans did not march out and face Mardonius, if they continued to cower behind their wall at the isthmus, then Athens would have no choice but to reconsider the Persian offer. It was a bluff, but it was a bluff that worked. The Spartans, terrified of losing their most powerful naval ally, finally agreed to send their army north. The man chosen to lead the Greek army was Pausanias, son of Cleombrotus, and regent for the young king Pleistarchus, the son of Leonidas. Pausanias was in his early 30s, young for such a command, but he came from the Aegeid royal family and he understood the weight of the legacy he carried. His uncle Leonidas had died at Thermopylae, buying time for Greece with his blood and the blood of 300 Spartans. Now Pausanias would lead the largest Spartan army ever assembled into battle against the very enemy that had killed his king. The pressure on him was immense, and the decisions he would make in the coming weeks would determine not just the fate of Greece, but the fate of Western civilization itself. The Greek army that marched north in the summer of 479 BC was unlike anything Greece had ever seen. Herodotus, the historian who recorded these events, claims that the Greek force numbered over 100,000 men, though modern historians believe the real number was probably closer to 70 or 80,000. The Spartans alone brought 10,000 hoplites, an unprecedented deployment of Spartan military power. Athens contributed 8,000 hoplites still, fighting despite having no city to return to. Corinth, Megara, Tegea, and dozens of other Greek cities sent their own contingents. It was a true pan-Hellenic army, united by desperation and rage. Mardonius watched the Greek army approach and made his own calculations. He had numerical superiority, perhaps 2-1 or even 3-1, depending on how many Persian troops had been stationed with him. But he also knew that Greek hoplites were the finest infantry in the world. In close combat, with their heavy bronze armour and their long spears and their unbreakable phalanx formations, the Greeks were nearly invincible. So Mardonius chose his battlefield carefully. He positioned his army near the city of Plataea, on the northern slopes of the Athenian River, in terrain that was perfect for cavalry operations. The ground was flat, open, and offered clear lines of sight for his mounted archers. If he could keep the Greeks at a distance, if he could harass them with cavalry raids and cut off their supplies, he could break their army without ever engaging in the kind of close-quarters infantry battle that favoured the Greeks. For 11 days the two armies faced each other across the Athenian River. Neither side wanted to make the first move. Pausanias held the high ground on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, a position that was defensible but difficult to supply. Mardonius controlled the river and the plains, but attacking uphill against a Greek phalanx would be suicidal, so instead the Persians launched cavalry raids. Wave after wave of Persian horsemen, armed with javelins and compound bows, rode up to the Greek positions and unleashed storms of arrows and projectiles. The Greeks, huddled behind their heavy shields, took casualties but held their ground. It was brutal, grinding warfare, and it was exactly what Mardonius wanted. The turning point came on the 8th day when Persian cavalry captured the mountain pass that the Greeks were using to bring in supplies. Convoy of food and equipment was intercepted and destroyed, and suddenly the Greek army found itself in a crisis. They were running out of water, running out of food, and running out of time. Pausanias held a council of war with his commanders and made a decision that would be debated by military historians for centuries. He would retreat. Not a full retreat back to the Peloponnese, but a tactical withdrawal to a new position closer to Plataea itself, where there was fresh water and better defensive terrain. The movement would be executed at night to minimize the risk of a Persian attack during the maneuver. The night withdrawal was a disaster. In the darkness and confusion, the Greek battle line fragmented. Some units moved too early, others refused to move at all. A Spartan commander named Amompharitos, furious at what he saw as a cowardly retreat, refused to obey orders and kept his regiment in position. The Athenians, on the left flank of the Greek army, became separated from the Spartans on the right. When dawn broke on what would become the day of the Battle of Plataea, the Greek army was strung out across miles of terrain, disorganized, vulnerable, and exposed. Mardonius, watching from his command post, could hardly believe his eyes. The Greeks were in full retreat. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. He gave the order to attack. The Persian army surged forward in pursuit of what they believed was a broken enemy. Mardonius led from the front, riding at the head of his elite cavalry and his personal guard of 1,000 elite Persian infantry. They charged toward the Spartan position, which now consisted of only about 10,000 Spartans and 3,000 Tigranes, isolated and apparently helpless. Persian arrows filled the air. Persian cavalry wheeled and struck at the Greek flanks, and for a moment it looked like the Greeks were about to be annihilated. But Pausanias was not retreating. He was waiting. He had chosen his ground carefully, a stretch of terrain where the Persian cavalry would have difficulty manoeuvring and where his hoplites would have room to form their phalanx. As the Persians closed the distance, the Spartans and Tigranes locked their shields and levelled their spears. Pausanias, according to legend, performed a sacrifice to the gods, praying for victory as Persian arrows slammed into the ground around him. And then, when the omens were finally favourable, he gave the order that would change the course of the battle. Advance. The Spartan phalanx moved forward as one organism, a wall of bronze and iron and unbreakable will. The Persians, expecting the Greeks to break and run, suddenly found themselves facing the most disciplined and ferocious infantry force in the ancient world. The Spartans crashed into the Persian lines with the force of a battering ram. Persian shields made of wicker and leather shattered under the impact of Greek spears. Persian soldiers wearing lighter armour and armed with shorter weapons found themselves outmatched in close combat. The Spartans pushed forward step by step, their phalanx grinding through the Persian formation like a machine designed for nothing but killing. Mardonius, seeing his front line collapsing, committed his elite guard to the fight. These were the immortals, the best soldiers Persia had to offer, men who had fought in a dozen campaigns and never known defeat. They fought with desperate courage, forming a shield wall of their own and trying to halt the Spartan advance. For a brief moment the battle hung in the balance. The immortals held. The Spartans pushed. Men died by the hundreds in the crush of bodies and bronze, and then a Spartan spear found its mark. Mardonius, fighting in the front ranks like a hero from the age of Homer, was struck down and killed. The commander of the Persian army fell in the dirt of Boeotia, and with him fell the morale of his entire force. The death of Mardonius broke the Persian army. The immortals, seeing their general dead, began to fall back. The fall back became a retreat. The retreat became a rout. Thousands of Persian soldiers turned and ran, streaming back toward their fortified camp near the Asopus River. The Spartans and Tigranes pursued, cutting down the fleeing enemy with methodical efficiency. And then, from the Greek left flank, the Athenians arrived. The Athenian hoplites, led by Aristides, had heard the sounds of battle and rushed to join the fight. They hit the Persian camp from a different direction, smashing through the wooden palisades and pouring into the fortified position where the remnants of the Persian army had taken shelter. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Persians, trapped inside their own camp with no line of retreat, were slaughtered by the thousands. Greek hoplites moved through the camp systematically, killing every Persian soldier they could find. The Thebans and other Greek allies of Persia tried to flee, but many were cut down as they ran. By the end of the day, the Persian army that had occupied Greece for nearly a year had ceased to exist. The Battle of Plataea was over. The Greeks had won the greatest land victory in their history. Mardonius was dead. His army was destroyed. The Persian threat to mainland Greece was finished. But as the Greeks celebrated their victory, as they looted the Persian camp and counted their dead, and gave thanks to the gods, they had no idea that across the Aegean Sea another battle was about to begin. A battle that would prove to be just as decisive, just as brutal, and according to legend, would happen on the exact same day. Across the wine-dark waters of the Aegean, King Leotychidas was leading the Greek fleet toward the shores of Asia Minor, unaware that the greatest land victory in Greek history had just been won. His ships, a little over 100 strong after the Allied contingents gathered, were rowing east with a single purpose: to find the Persian fleet and destroy it. The Greeks had received intelligence from Samian exiles that the Persians had beached their ships near Mount Mycale and were preparing to defend them behind wooden fortifications. It was a bold strategy by the Persians, but it was also a strategy born from desperation. The Persian admirals knew they could not defeat the Greek navy in open water. Salamis had proven that. So they would force the Greeks to come ashore and fight a land battle, where Persian numbers might make the difference. As the Greek fleet approached the island of Samos, sailing along the southern coast toward the town, the Persian lookout spotted them and raised the alarm. The Persian camp erupted into frantic activity. Commanders shouted orders. Soldiers rushed to their positions behind the wooden palisades. The Ionian Greek soldiers fighting for Persia were disarmed and pushed to the rear, where the Persian commanders could keep an eye on them and prevent any treachery. The Persians knew that the loyalty of the Ionians was fragile at best, that these Greeks might turn on their Persian masters the moment the battle began. But there was no time to send them away, no time to reorganize. The Greeks were here. Leotychidas stood on the deck of his flagship and surveyed the Persian position. What he saw was intimidating. Hundreds of Persian ships pulled up onto the beach, their hulls protected by a massive wooden stockade that ran along the shoreline. Behind the stockade, thousands of Persian soldiers waited in formation, their armour glinting in the afternoon sun. The terrain favoured the defenders. The Greeks would have to run their ships onto the beach, disembark under fire, and then assault a fortified position uphill. It was exactly the kind of battle that could go disastrously wrong. But Leotychidas also knew something that the Persians did not know. He knew that Greek hoplites, when properly motivated, were capable of achieving the impossible. Before ordering the landing, Leotychidas did something that would become one of the most famous moments in Greek military history. He sailed his flagship close to the shore, close enough that his voice could carry to both the Greek marines on the ships and the Greek soldiers waiting on the beach. And then he gave a speech. He reminded his men that they were not just fighting for Greece, but fighting to liberate their Ionian brothers who had been enslaved by Persia for decades. He told them that the Persians were demoralized, frightened, and ready to break. He told them that victory was not just possible but inevitable, and then he said something that sent a wave of electricity through the entire Greek force. He told them that the Greeks had already won a great victory at Plataea, that Pausanias had destroyed Mardonius and his army, that the Persian threat to mainland Greece was over. It was impossible. There had been no messenger. There was no way that news could have travelled from Boeotia to the coast of Asia Minor in a single day. And yet every Greek soldier believed it. They believed it because they wanted to believe it. Because the idea that both battles would be won on the same day felt like divine intervention. Like the gods themselves had decreed that this was the day Persia would fall. The rumour spread through the Greek fleet like wildfire, and suddenly men who'd been nervous about the coming battle were cheering and banging their spears against their shields, ready to charge into hell itself. Whether the rumour was true or false, whether it was a brilliant psychological ploy by Leotychidas or a genuine message delivered by some unknown means, the effect was immediate and overwhelming. The Greek landing force, a few thousand marines and many more volunteers from the crews and accompanying contingents, disembarked from their ships and formed up on the beach in phalanx formation. The Spartans took the left wing, the Athenians took the right. The soldiers from Corinth, Sicyon, and the other Greek cities filled the centre, and then, with a roar that echoed across the water and up the slopes of Mount Mycale, the Greeks charged. The Persians, watching from behind their wooden walls, braced for impact. Archers drew their bows and fired volley after volley of arrows into the advancing Greek line. Persian soldiers gripped their spears and shields and prepared to sell their lives dearly. The commanders shouted encouragement, reminding their men that they outnumbered the Greeks and that the fortifications would give them the advantage. But in their hearts, many of the Persian soldiers already knew how this battle would end. They'd heard the stories from Salamis. They'd heard about Marathon a decade earlier, where a smaller Greek force had smashed a Persian army on the plains of Attica. And now they were about to experience firsthand why the Greeks were the masters of infantry warfare. The Greek phalanx reached the stockade and did not slow down. Hoplites hacked at the wooden, stakes with axes and swords tearing down sections of the wall and pouring through the gaps. The Athenians on the right wing, moving along the coastal road, reached the Persian position first and smashed into the defenders with devastating force. Persian soldiers who tried to stand and fight were cut down. Persian soldiers who tried to retreat found their escape blocked by their own fortifications. The battle devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat, with Greek hoplites pushing deeper into the Persian camp step by step, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. The Spartans on the left wing took a different route. Instead of attacking along the coast, they moved through the hills and rough terrain inland, using the slopes of Mount Mycale to flank the Persian position. It was a longer march, and it meant the Spartans arrived at the battle later than the Athenians. But when they did arrive, they came from a direction the Persians were not expecting. They emerged from the interior of the promontory and fell on the Persian flank and rear, cutting off the line of retreat and trapping thousands of Persian soldiers between the two Greek wings. The Persians fought with the courage of men who knew they were doomed. The ethnic Persians, the elite troops who formed the core of the army, held their ground and died where they stood. But the other contingents, the Greeks and Egyptians and Phoenicians, who had been pressed into service by the Persian Empire, began to break. And then the moment that the Persian commanders had feared finally arrived. The Ionian Greeks, who'd been disarmed and pushed to the rear of the camp, saw that the battle was turning against Persia. They saw their kinsmen from the mainland cutting through the Persian lines, and they made their choice. The Ionians turned on their Persian masters. What had been a battle became a slaughter. Ionian soldiers, armed with whatever weapons they could find, began attacking Persian troops from behind. The Samians, who had been secretly working with the Greeks all along, joined the assault. The Milesians, who'd been tasked with guarding the mountain passes behind the Persian camp, began misdirecting fleeing Persian soldiers, sending them back into the arms of the advancing Greeks or simply killing them outright. The Persian army disintegrated. Men who tried to flee found every escape route blocked. Men who tried to surrender found no mercy. The Greeks, remembering Athens, remembering the burned temples and the slaughtered civilians, showed no quarter. By the time the sun began to set over the Aegean, the Battle of Mycale was over. The Persian army had been annihilated. Every Persian soldier who could not escape into the mountains was dead. The Persian fleet, beached and defenceless, was set ablaze. Ship after ship went up in flames, the same flames that had consumed Athens now consuming the pride of the Persian navy. The Greeks stood on the beach and watched the fires burn, watched the smoke rise into the sky, and knew that they had done something extraordinary. They had taken the war to Asia, they had destroyed the enemy on his own soil, and they had proven that the age of Persian dominance was over. And then, in the days that followed, as Greek messengers finally made contact between the two armies, the truth emerged. The Battle of Plataea and the Battle of Mycale had indeed been fought on the same day. The rumour that had spread through the Greek fleet at Mycale had been true. Mardonius was dead. The Persian army in Greece was destroyed. The Persian fleet in Asia was destroyed. On a single day in the summer of 429 BC, the Greeks had won 2 battles that would change the course of Western civilization. The twin victories, the day Persia fell. Before we continue with the brutal details of what happened next, I want to tell you about the incredible new merch collection we've just launched at Wars and History. We've got designs featuring the greatest battles, the most legendary warriors, and the tactics that changed history. Head to the link in the description and grab your gear. Now let's get back to the beach at Mycale, where the real story's about to get even more brutal. The morning of the battle began with an eerie silence. The Greek fleet, a little over 100 warships strong, lay at anchor off the southern coast of Samos. The ships rocked gently in the calm waters of the Aegean, their crews watching the distant shore where the Persian fleet waited behind wooden walls. It was late August of 479 BC, and the air was thick with the heat of summer and the tension of impending violence. Every man in the Greek fleet knew that the next few hours would determine not just the outcome of the war, but the fate of every Greek city on the coast of Asia Minor. The Ionians had been enslaved for 2 decades. Today they would either be liberated or condemned to another generation of Persian rule. King Leotychidas stood on the deck of his flagship and surveyed his commanders. The Spartan marines, bronze armour polished to a mirror shine, stood in ranks waiting for orders. The Athenian sailors, veterans of Salamis and a dozen naval battles, checked their weapons and adjusted their helmets. The men from Corinth, Sicyon, Epidaurus, and the other Greek cities prepared themselves for what every one of them understood would be a brutal and bloody assault. These were not professional soldiers. They were citizens, farmers, merchants, craftsmen who had taken up arms to defend their freedom. But they were also men who had spent the last year watching their world burn, and they were ready to make the Persians pay for every temple destroyed, every city razed, every Greek killed. The Persian position at Mycale was formidable. The fleet, perhaps 200 to 300 ships depending on the ancient accounts, had been pulled up onto the beach in tight rows. The ships were arranged in columns 3 deep, each vessel roughly 35 metres long and about 5 metres wide. The entire fleet stretched along the coastline for nearly 500 metres, creating a massive barrier between the sea and the Persian camp. Around this fleet, the Persians had constructed a wooden palisade using stakes driven deep into the sand and rocky soil, reinforced with tree trunks and stones hauled down from the slopes of Mount Mycale. The fortification was primitive by the standards of siege warfare, but it was effective. It created a wall between the Greeks and their target, a wall that would have to be torn down with axes and bare hands under a rain of Persian arrows. Behind the palisade waited the Persian army, 60,000 men under the command of Tigranes, a Persian nobleman described by the historians as a man of exceptional beauty and stature. Tigranes had positioned his forces carefully. The ethnic Persian troops, the elite core of his army, held the centre of the line where the fighting would be heaviest. These were professional soldiers, men who had trained their entire lives for war, equipped with the finest weapons and armour the Persian Empire could provide. They wore scale armour that covered their torsos and thighs, and they carried large wicker shields reinforced with leather and metal bosses. Their primary weapons were spears and short swords, designed for close-quarters combat. They were not as heavily armoured as Greek hoplites, but they were disciplined, experienced, and absolutely loyal to the Persian king. The flanks of the Persian line were held by the subject peoples of the empire, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Cypriots, and most importantly Ionian Greeks, who'd been conscripted into Persian service. These men were the wild card in Tigranes' strategy. The Persian commanders knew that the Ionians couldn't be trusted, that they might defect or even turn on their Persian overlords the moment the battle began. So the Ionians had been disarmed. Their swords and spears had been taken away, and they had been positioned in the rear of the formation where the Persian officers could watch them. It was a pragmatic decision, but it was also a decision that revealed the fundamental weakness of the Persian position. An army that does not trust its own soldiers is an army already on the edge of collapse. Leotychidas gave the order to advance, and the Greek fleet began to move. The ships rowed forward in line abreast, a formation that allowed the entire fleet to beach simultaneously and disembark their marines as quickly as possible. As the Greek ships approached the shore, Leotychidas did something that would be remembered for centuries. He ordered his flagship to move ahead of the others, sailing so close to the beach that his voice could carry to the Persian camp. And then he shouted a message directly to the Ionian Greeks fighting for Persia. His words were simple and devastating. He reminded the Ionians that they were Greeks, that they shared blood and language and gods with the men now coming to liberate them. He told them that the mainland Greeks had not forgotten them, that they had crossed the Aegean specifically to free them from Persian tyranny. He invoked the name of freedom itself, the word that defined what it meant to be Greek. And then he told them about the rumour, the impossible rumour that was sweeping through the Greek fleet. He told them that the Greeks had won a great victory at Plataea on this very day, that Mardonius was dead, that the Persian army in Europe had been destroyed. It was a psychological masterstroke, a piece of propaganda so perfectly timed and so emotionally resonant that it transformed the morale of both armies in an instant. The Greeks, hearing their king's words echoing across the water, erupted in cheers. They banged their spears against their shields and roared their defiance at the Persians. The rumour that Plataea had been won, whether true or not, gave them the confidence of men who believed. They were fighting on the winning side of history. The Ionians in the Persian camp, hearing those same words, began to whisper among themselves. Was it true? Had Plataea fallen? If the Persian army in Greece was destroyed, what hope did this small force at Mycale have? The seeds of doubt had been planted, and they would bear fruit before the day was done. The Greek ships hit the beach in a coordinated landing that must have been spectacular to witness. More than 100 warships running aground in a coordinated landing, their bronze-reinforced rams digging into the sand, their crews leaping over the sides and splashing through the shallows. The Marines came ashore in formation, shields locked, spears levelled, moving with the practised efficiency of men who had drilled for this moment. The Athenians landed on the right wing, taking the coastal route toward the Persian position. The Spartans landed on the left wing, choosing a more difficult path through the rocky terrain and the slopes of Mount Mycale. The centre of the Greek line was filled with the hoplites from Corinth and the other allied cities, advancing in phalanx formation toward the wooden walls that stood between them and the Persian fleet. The Persians opened fire immediately. Archers stationed behind the palisade and on the decks of the beached ships drew their compound bows and began loosing volleys of arrows into the advancing Greeks. The sound was like a thunderstorm, hundreds of bowstrings snapping simultaneously, arrows hissing through the air, bronze and iron arrowheads clattering off Greek shields and armour. Some arrows found gaps in the Greek formations, striking men in the legs or the exposed parts of their arms. Greeks fell, bleeding and screaming, but the phalanx did not stop. The men in the rear ranks simply stepped over the wounded and kept advancing, maintaining the integrity of the formation no matter the cost. The distance from the beach to the Persian palisade was perhaps 300 metres, and every metre was contested. Persian archers continued to fire volley after volley. Greek hoplites, hunched behind their massive shields, pushed forward step by step. The weight of their bronze armour, easily 30 to 40 pounds per man, made the advance exhausting in the summer heat. Men gasped for breath inside their helmets, sweat pouring down their faces, legs burning with fatigue. But they kept moving because stopping meant death, because the only way to survive the arrow storm was to reach the enemy and engage in close combat where Greek superiority was absolute. The Athenians on the right wing reached the Persian fortifications first. They had taken the coastal route, the flattest and most direct path to the enemy position, and they hit the palisade like a battering ram. Greek hoplites threw themselves at the wooden stakes, hacking with axes and swords, tearing down sections of the wall with their bare hands. Persian defenders thrust spears through the gaps, trying to keep the Greeks at bay, but the momentum of the assault was unstoppable. The Athenians, remembering their burned city, remembering the destruction of the Acropolis, fought with a fury that bordered on madness. They broke through the palisade in multiple locations and poured into the Persian camp, their bronze spears finding targets with every thrust. The fighting inside the camp was chaos. Persian soldiers tried to form defensive lines, but the confined space and the speed of the Greek assault made organized resistance nearly impossible. Athenian hoplites pushed deeper into the camp, their phalanx formation breaking apart into individual combats as the terrain and the press of bodies made cohesive movement impossible. Greek shields bashed into Persian faces. Greek spears punched through Persian armour. Persian soldiers, fighting desperately, tried to hold their ground, but they were being overwhelmed by men who fought with the confidence of inevitable victory, and then the rumour arrived. No one knows exactly how it spread, whether it was Leotychidas' speech or some mysterious message that travelled faster than any human messenger could run. But suddenly, every Greek soldier in the battle was shouting the same thing. Plataea had fallen. Mardonius was dead. The Persian army was destroyed. The Greeks believed they were witnessing divine intervention, that the gods themselves had decreed that both battles would be won on the same day. The psychological effect was devastating. Greek soldiers who had been fighting cautiously, conserving their strength, now threw themselves into the battle with reckless abandon. They believed they could not lose, that fate itself was on their side. The Persians, hearing the Greek cheers and seeing the ferocity of the assault, began to waver. The soldiers on the front lines, the ethnic Persians who had held their ground against the initial Greek attack, found themselves being pushed back step by step. The weight of the Greek phalanx, the relentless pressure of men pushing forward with locked shields was impossible to resist. Persian soldiers who tried to stand and fight were trampled. Persian soldiers who tried to retreat found their escape blocked by their own comrades pressing forward from behind. The battle line began to buckle. On the left wing of the Greek army, the Spartans were making their move. They had chosen a longer and more difficult route, moving through the hills and broken terrain that rose up from the beach toward the slopes of Mount Mycale. It was a flanking maneuver, designed to bring the Spartans into the Persian camp from an unexpected direction. The terrain was brutal. The Spartans, wearing their full bronze armour and carrying their heavy shields and spears, had to climb over rocks, push through scrub brush, and navigate steep inclines. It was exhausting work, and it meant the Spartans arrived at the battle later than the Athenians. But when they finally emerged from the interior of the promontory and fell on the Persian flank, the effect was catastrophic. The Persians had been focused entirely on the Athenian assault coming from the coast. They had positioned their forces to resist an attack from that direction, with their strongest units holding the centre and left of their line. The right flank, where the hills and rough terrain met the camp, had been left relatively undefended because the Persian commanders believed no army would attempt to advance through such difficult ground. They were wrong. The Spartans came out of the hills like wolves descending on a flock of sheep, hitting the Persian right flank with overwhelming force. Persian soldiers, caught completely by surprise, tried to wheel their formation to meet this new threat, but it was too late. The Spartans were already among them, their spears thrusting, their shields bashing, their battle cries echoing across the camp. Tigranes, the Persian commander, tried desperately to restore order. He rode through the camp on horseback, shouting commands, trying to rally his troops and establish a coherent defensive line. For a brief moment it seemed like he might succeed. The ethnic Persian troops, the professionals who formed the core of the army, responded to his orders and began to form up around his position. They created a shield wall, overlapping their wicker shields to provide mutual protection, and braced their spears for the Greek assault. It was a textbook defensive formation, the kind that had won battles for Persia across 3 continents, but this was not a normal battle, and the Greeks were not a normal enemy. The Greek phalanx hit the Persian shield wall with the force of an avalanche. The sound of the impact must have been deafening, bronze crashing against wicker, wood splintering, men screaming. The front ranks of the phalanx, their spears levelled at chest height, punched through the Persian shields like they were made of paper. The weight of the Greek advance, the mass of men pushing from behind, drove the phalanx forward with irresistible momentum. Persian soldiers tried to hold, tried to push back, but they were fighting against physics itself. The Greek hoplites, each man weighing over 200 pounds with his armour, pushed forward in unison, and the Persian line simply could not withstand the pressure. The shield wall broke. Persian soldiers stumbled backward, tripping over their own feet, falling into the men behind them. The formation collapsed into a mass of panicked individuals, each man fighting for his own survival. Tigranes, seeing his army disintegrating around him, made a last desperate stand. He and his personal guard, perhaps a few hundred of the most elite Persian troops, formed a circle and fought to the death. Greek hoplites surrounded them and closed in, spears thrusting from every direction. Tigranes fell, struck down by multiple spear thrusts, his beautiful armour soaked in blood. With his death, the last organised Persian resistance ended. The battle became a rout. Persian soldiers who had been fighting now turned and ran, streaming toward the rear of the camp in a desperate attempt to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The Spartans on the left had cut off the main line of retreat. The Athenians on the right were pushing deeper into the camp, killing everything in their path. The Persian soldiers found themselves trapped between 2 wings of the Greek army, with no hope of escape. Some tried to surrender, throwing down their weapons and begging for mercy. They received none. The Greeks, remembering Athens, remembering the temples burned and the civilians slaughtered, showed no quarter. This was not a battle. This was an execution. And then came the moment that would define the Battle of Mycale as one of the most brutal and decisive victories in Greek military history. The Ionians, who had been disarmed and pushed to the rear of the Persian camp, saw that the battle was lost. They saw their Persian masters being slaughtered. They saw their kinsmen from the mainland cutting through the Persian ranks like a scythe through wheat. And they made their choice. The Ionians turned on the Persians. It started with the Samians. They had been secretly communicating with the Greeks for weeks, plotting this betrayal, waiting for the right moment. When they saw the Persian line collapse, they picked up whatever weapons they could find, rocks, clubs, fallen swords and spears, and began attacking Persian soldiers from behind. The Milesians, who had been positioned in the rear guarding the mountain passes that led away from the camp, stopped directing fleeing Persians to safety, and instead began directing them back into the battle or simply killing them outright. Other Ionian contingents followed suit, and within minutes the entire rear of the Persian camp erupted into chaos. Persian soldiers who had been fleeing the Greek assault now found themselves being attacked by their own allies. Men who'd been fighting side by side moments before were now killing each other. The betrayal was complete. The massacre that followed was one of the bloodiest in ancient warfare. Trapped between the advancing Greeks and the revolting Ionians, with no line of retreat and no hope of survival, the Persian soldiers were slaughtered by the thousands. The beach at Mycale ran red with blood. Bodies piled up inside the camp, stacked 3 and 4 deep in some places. Greek hoplites moved through the carnage methodically, killing every Persian soldier they could find. Some Persians tried to hide among the beached ships, crawling into the hulls and praying the Greeks would not find them. They were found and killed. Some Persians tried to escape by climbing the slopes of Mount Mycale, fleeing into the mountains. Most of them were hunted down by the Ionians, who knew every path and trail in the region. Only a handful of Persian soldiers, perhaps a few hundred out of an army of 60,000, managed to escape and make the long journey back to Sardis. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the Battle of Mycale was over. The Persian army had been annihilated. Tigranes and his senior commanders were dead. The camp was in Greek hands, and the Persian fleet, the last remnant of the navy that had once dominated the Aegean, lay defenceless on the beach, ready for destruction. But before the Greeks could set the ships ablaze, they had one more task to complete. They had to loot the Persian camp, to claim the spoils of victory that would compensate them for the years of sacrifice and loss. The Persian camp was filled with treasures, chests of gold and silver, looted from Greek cities and meant to pay the Persian soldiers, weapons and armour piled in storehouses, food and wine, luxury goods from across the Persian Empire. The Greek soldiers moved through the camp like locusts, taking everything of value. Some men became rich in a single afternoon, finding enough gold to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Others found personal items that had been stolen from Greek temples, religious artifacts that had been taken as trophies by the Persians. These items were treated with reverence, set aside to be returned to their proper homes. And then, when the looting was complete, the Greeks set fire to the Persian fleet. Ship after ship was dragged away from the palisade and set ablaze. The fires spread quickly, consuming the wooden hulls and the canvas sails and the pitch that sealed the seams. Within an hour, the entire Persian fleet was burning. The smoke rose into the sky in a massive column, visible for miles in every direction. Greek sailors stood on the beach and watched the fires burn, watching the symbol of Persian naval power reduced to ash and char. It was the same fire that had consumed Athens, turned back on the empire that had started this war. It was revenge, pure and absolute. The fires at Mycale burned for hours. The smoke rose into the sky in a column so massive that it could be seen from the island of Samos, across the strait where Persian refugees watched their fleet and their army reduced to ashes and memories. Greek soldiers stood on the beach, exhausted, blooded, their armour dented and stained with Persian blood, and watched the culmination of their revenge. 200 Persian ships, each one a masterpiece of naval engineering, each one capable of carrying 170 rowers and 40 marines, each one worth more than most Greek cities could afford to build, consumed by flames. The destruction was total. The message was clear. Persia would never again dominate the Aegean. But the true brutality of Mycale was not in the burning of the ships. It was in what had happened to the men who had defended them. The Persian casualties at Mycale numbered in the tens of thousands. Modern historians estimate that out of an army of 60,000 Persian soldiers, fewer than 1,000 escaped alive. The rest were killed in the battle or in the massacre that followed, and a significant portion of those deaths came not from Greek spears, but from the treachery of the Ionians who had turned on their Persian masters at the moment of crisis. The betrayal of the Ionians was the defining moment of the Battle of Mycale, the moment that transformed a difficult victory into a complete annihilation. The Samians had been planning their defection for weeks, secretly communicating with the Greek fleet, feeding intelligence about Persian dispositions and morale to Leotychidas and his commanders. They had watched the Persians with hatred in their hearts. These Greeks who had been forced to fight against their own people, who had been conscripted into an army that was destroying their homeland. When the battle began and they saw the Greek phalanx breaking through the Persian defences, they made their move. The Samian soldiers, who'd been disarmed by the Persian commanders and pushed to the rear of the camp where they could be watched, began arming themselves with whatever they could find. Rocks became weapons, tent poles became spears. Fallen Persian swords and daggers were picked up and turned against their former owners. The Samians moved through the rear of the Persian camp in groups, hunting down isolated Persian soldiers, cutting them down from behind, spreading chaos and terror through an army that was already collapsing under the Greek assault. When other Ionian contingents saw the Samians attacking the Persians, they joined in. The Chians, the Lesbians, the soldiers from Miletus and Ephesus, and the other Greek cities of Asia Minor all turned on the empire that had enslaved them. The Milesians were particularly brutal in their betrayal. They had been assigned to guard the mountain passes behind the Persian camp, the routes that led inland towards safety. As Persian soldiers fled from the Greek assault, running desperately for the passes that would take them away from the slaughter, the Milesians met them with smiles and directions. But the directions were lies. The Milesians sent fleeing Persian soldiers not toward safety, but back toward the Greek lines, directing them into ambushes and dead ends. Other Persians who tried to escape through the passes were simply killed outright, stabbed in the back as they ran, their bodies left in the dirt for the vultures. The Milesians, who had been the leaders of the Ionian revolt 20 years earlier, who had seen their city burned and their people enslaved by Persian vengeance, took their revenge with interest. The psychological impact of the Ionian betrayal on the Persian survivors was devastating. The Persian Empire was built on the loyalty of its subject peoples, on the idea that the great king ruled by divine right, and that resistance was not just futile but blasphemous. The Ionians had shattered that illusion. They had shown that the empire was held together not by love or loyalty, but by fear and force, and that when the force wavered, the fear turned to hatred. The handful of Persian soldiers who managed to escape Mycale and make the long journey back to Sardis carried with them stories of the betrayal, stories that spread through the Persian military and sowed seeds of doubt about the reliability of the empire's Greek subjects. But for the Greeks, the Ionian betrayal was not just a military tactic. It was a moral statement, a declaration that blood and culture and language mattered more than empire and conquest. The Ionians had risked everything by turning on the Persians. If the battle had gone differently, if the Persians had somehow managed to win at Mycale, the Ionians who had defected would have been hunted down and executed with their entire families. But the battle had not gone differently. The Greeks had won, and the Ionians were free. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Mycale was a scene of organized chaos. The Greek army spent the rest of the day and the following night securing the battlefield, collecting the wounded, counting the dead, and systematically looting everything of value from the Persian camp. The spoils were extraordinary. The Persian army had been preparing for a long campaign, and their supply depot was filled with gold and silver, weapons and armour, food and wine, luxury goods from across the empire. There were chests of coins, stamped with the image of the Persian king, gold darics that would become the standard currency of international trade for the next century. There were Persian royal robes, silk and purple dye, worth more than their weight in gold. There were weapons of high quality, fine blades of iron and early steel, and composite bows made by master craftsmen. All of it was divided among the Greek soldiers according to their city's contribution to the battle. The Athenians, who had borne the brunt of the fighting on the right wing and had been the first to break through the Persian fortifications, claimed the largest share of the spoils. The Spartans, who had executed the flanking manoeuvre that had sealed the Persian defeat, took their own substantial portion. The other Greek cities divided what remained, with the Corinthians and Sicyonians and the smaller contingents each receiving enough gold and treasure to make their soldiers wealthy men. It was the kind of plunder that changed lives, that turned farmers and craftsmen into men of property and influence. But the most important treasure recovered from the Persian camp was not gold or weapons, it was information. The Greeks found documents, correspondence between the Persian commanders and the satrapy of Sardis, intelligence about Persian military dispositions across Asia Minor. They found lists of Greek cities that had collaborated with Persia, names of Greek officials who had accepted Persian bribes, evidence of the networks of spies and informers that the Persians had cultivated throughout the Greek world. This information would be used in the coming months to identify and punish collaborators, to settle old scores, and to prepare for the next phase of the war. Because the war was not over. The Greeks had won at Plataea and Mycale, had destroyed the Persian army and fleet, had liberated the Ionian cities from Persian occupation. But Persia itself was still intact, still powerful, still capable of rebuilding its forces and launching another invasion if given enough time. The Greek commanders gathered on the beach at Mycale and debated their next move. The Spartans, conservative and cautious by nature, argued that the Greeks should return home. They had achieved their objective. Greece was safe. The Persians had been driven out of Europe. Continuing the war into Asia would be overreach, would stretch Greek resources too thin, would risk turning victory into defeat. The Athenians disagreed. Led by Xanthippus, the father of the great Pericles who would later lead Athens during its golden age, the Athenians argued that this was the moment to press the advantage, to take the war to Persian territory, to ensure that Persia could never threaten Greece again. They pointed out that the Ionian cities were now free but vulnerable, that without Greek support they would quickly be reconquered by Persian forces from the interior. They argued that the Hellespont, the narrow strait that connected the Aegean to the Black Sea, needed to be secured to protect Greek trade routes and prevent future Persian invasions. They wanted to continue the offensive, to liberate not just the islands but the coastal cities of Asia Minor, to create a buffer zone between Greece and Persia. The debate was intense and revealed the fundamental differences in strategic thinking between Athens and Sparta. The Spartans were a land power, focused on defending their territory and maintaining their dominance over the Peloponnese. They saw the war in limited terms as a defensive conflict that had been won once the Persian army was expelled from Greece. The Athenians were a naval power, focused on trade and expansion, and the projection of force across the sea. They saw the war as an opportunity, a chance to establish Athenian influence across the Aegean and to position Athens as the dominant power in the Greek world. In the end, the Greeks reached a compromise. The fleet would sail to the Hellespont to destroy the pontoon bridges that Xerxes had built, to cross from Asia into Europe. If the bridges were still intact, they would be destroyed to prevent any future Persian army from using them. If they were already gone, the fleet would decide what to do next. It was a limited objective, acceptable to both the Spartans and the Athenians, and it kept the Greek alliance together for a few more months. The Greek fleet sailed from Mycale to the Hellespont, first to Lecton and then to Abydos, where the bridges had been constructed. But when they arrived, they found that the bridges were already destroyed, torn apart by winter storms and the retreat of the Persian army. The Spartans, seeing that their objective had been achieved, declared victory and sailed home. King Leotychidas took the Spartan contingent back to the Peloponnese, ending Sparta's direct participation in the offensive phase of the war. But the Athenians stayed. Xanthippus and the Athenian fleet, reinforced by the newly liberated Ionians who had joined the Greek cause, turned their attention to the Persian stronghold of Sestos on the European side of the Hellespont. The siege of Sestos lasted through the entire winter of 479 to 478 BC, and it was a brutal affair. The city was heavily fortified and defended by a Persian garrison under the command of a governor named Artayctes, a man described by Herodotus as cruel and corrupt. The Athenians established a blockade by land and sea, cutting off all supplies to the city. Inside Sestos, the Persian garrison and the city's inhabitants began to starve. Food ran out. People began eating leather and bark and anything else that could provide sustenance. The desperation grew so extreme that Artayctes and some of his officers attempted to escape by night, fleeing along the coast toward Thrace. They were hunted down by Athenian patrols and allied forces. Artayctes was captured and executed. Some accounts describe a crucifixion on the spot where Xerxes had built his bridges, a symbolic act of vengeance that sent a clear message about the fate that awaited Persian officials who had oppressed Greek cities. With the fall of Sestos in the spring of 478 BC, the last Persian stronghold on the European side of the Hellespont was in Greek hands. The Athenians had secured the strait, guaranteed safe passage for Greek merchant ships travelling to the Black Sea, and established themselves as the liberators and protectors of the Ionian Greeks. It was a turning point not just in the war but in the history of Greece itself, because what happened next would transform Athens from a powerful city-state into an empire that would dominate the Aegean for half a century. The formation of the Delian League in 478 BC was the direct consequence of the victories at Plataea and Mycale and the liberation of the Ionian cities. The League was conceived as a defensive alliance, a coalition of Greek city-states united under Athenian leadership to continue the war against Persia and prevent any future Persian invasions. The headquarters of the League was established on the sacred island of Delos, where the League's treasury would be kept and where representatives from the member states would meet to make decisions. The League began with around 150 member states, primarily the islands of the Aegean and the Greek cities of the Asia Minor coast. Each member was required to contribute either ships to the common fleet or money to support naval operations. Athens, as the dominant naval power and the city that had led the liberation of Ionia, was the natural leader of the League. The Athenian general Aristides, known as the Just for his incorruptible character, was tasked with assessing how much each member state should contribute. His assessments were considered fair and reasonable, and the League began its operations with genuine enthusiasm and unity of purpose. The Delian League launched successful military campaigns against Persian strongholds, liberating more Greek cities clearing the Aegean of Persian naval forces and establishing Greek control over the sea lanes that connected the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. But over time, the Delian League transformed from a defensive alliance into an Athenian empire. Athens began to use the League's resources to rebuild its own city, to construct the magnificent temples and monuments that would define the Athenian Golden Age. The Parthenon, the temple to Athena that still stands today as one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, was built with funds that were supposed to be used for the common defence. The League's treasury was moved from Delos to Athens in 454 BC, a symbolic act that made clear who was really in control. Member states that tried to withdraw from the League were forced back in by military action, their walls torn down, their fleets confiscated, their governments replaced with Athenian-friendly regimes. The transformation of the Delian League into the Athenian Empire created resentment and fear among the other Greek city-states, particularly Sparta. The Spartans watched Athens grow more powerful with each passing year, watched Athenian influence spread across the Aegean, watched Athenian wealth increase as tribute flowed in from hundreds of subject cities. The rivalry between Athens and Sparta, the two powers that had stood together against Persia, became the defining conflict of Greek politics for the next generation. And in 431 BC, that rivalry erupted into the Peloponnesian War, a catastrophic conflict that would last 27 years and would ultimately destroy the golden age that had been built on the ashes of the Persian Wars. The Peloponnesian War was, in many ways, the bitter fruit of the victories at Plataea and Mycale. The twin battles that had saved Greece from Persian conquest had also set in motion the events that would lead to Greece destroying itself. Athens, emboldened by its role in defeating Persia and enriched by the resources of the Delian League, pursued an aggressive and expansionist foreign policy that threatened the balance of power in Greece. Sparta, watching Athens grow stronger and fearing for its own security, built a coalition of city-states to resist Athenian domination. When the war finally came, it was fought with a brutality and ruthlessness that matched anything the Persians had done. Greek fought Greek in battles that left cities destroyed and populations enslaved. The cultural and intellectual flowering that had defined the Golden Age of Athens was consumed by the flames of civil war. The irony was not lost on the historians who recorded these events. Herodotus, writing in the decades after the Persian Wars, saw the victories at Plataea and Mycale as the defining moments of Greek history, the moments when the Greeks proved that free men fighting for their homeland were superior to the enslaved masses of a despotic empire. Thucydides, writing during the Peloponnesian War, saw those same victories as the beginning of the end, the moment when Athens set itself on a path toward imperial overreach and eventual destruction. Both were right. The twin victories had saved Greece from Persian conquest and had ushered in the greatest period of cultural achievement in Western history. But they had also unleashed forces that the Greeks could not control, ambitions and rivalries that would tear their civilization apart. Yet for all the tragedy that followed, the battles of Plataea and Mycale remain among the most significant military engagements in human history. They ended the Persian Wars, the first great conflict between East and West, between autocracy and democracy, between the forces of empire and the forces of freedom. They secured the independence of Greece and created the conditions for the flourishing of Greek philosophy, art, drama, and political thought that would form the foundation of Western civilization. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Euripides, Herodotus, Thucydides, all of these towering figures of human intellectual achievement lived and worked in the aftermath of these battles in the world that was made possible by Greek victory. and the Battle of Mycale itself, though overshadowed by Plataea in most historical accounts, was in many ways the more significant of the twin victories. Plataea ended the Persian military threat to mainland Greece, but Mycale ended Persian naval power in the Aegean and opened the door for Greek expansion into Asia. It was at Mycale that the Ionians turned on their Persian masters and reclaimed their freedom. It was at Mycale that the Greeks demonstrated that they could project power across the sea and fight offensive wars on enemy territory. It was at Mycale that the Greek fleet, the instrument of Athenian power, proved its dominance and set the stage for the Athenian Empire that would follow. The burning of the Persian fleet at Mycale was more than just a military victory. It was a statement, a declaration that the age of Persian dominance in the Mediterranean was over. The ships that burned on that beach represented decades of Persian investment, thousands of skilled craftsmen and sailors, the naval power that had been built up since the reign of Cyrus the Great and had been used to conquer Egypt and Cyprus and the islands of the Aegean. All of it consumed in a single afternoon, all of it reduced to ash and charred timber. The Greeks stood on the beach and watched the fires burn and understood that they had done something that would be remembered for as long as humans told stories about war and courage and the struggle for freedom. These soldiers who fought at Mycale returned to their homes as heroes. They had been part of something larger than themselves, part of a moment when history pivoted on the edge of a sword. The Athenians who had broken through the Persian fortifications carried with them the knowledge that their city, though destroyed, would be rebuilt greater than before. The Spartans who had flanked the Persian position and cut off their retreat carried with them the pride of having upheld the legacy of Leonidas. The Ionians who had turned on the Persians carried with them the satisfaction of vengeance and the hope of a future free from imperial domination. But they also carried with them the weight of the dead. The Greek casualties at Mycale, though significantly lower than the Persian losses, were still substantial. Hundreds of Greek hoplites had fallen in the assault on the fortifications, struck down by Persian arrows or spears in the brutal hand-to-hand combat inside the camp. Their bodies were cremated on funeral pyres on the beach, the smoke of their burning rising alongside the smoke from the Persian ships. The Greeks honoured their dead with funeral games and sacrifices to the gods, thanking Zeus and Athena and Poseidon for the victory, asking the gods to receive the souls of the fallen into the afterlife with the honour they deserved. The Persian dead were left where they fell. There was no effort to collect the bodies, no funeral rites for the soldiers who had died far from their homes in service to an emperor who would never remember their names. The beach at Mycale was littered with corpses for weeks, the smell of death hanging over the coastline until scavengers and the elements finally reduced the bodies to bones and dust. It was a grim reminder of the cost of war, of the price that both sides paid for the ambitions of kings and the survival of nations. The sun set over. The Aegean on that day in late August of 479 BC, and with it set the age of Persian supremacy in the Greek world. The twin victories of Plataea and Mycale had accomplished what had seemed impossible just a year earlier. The Persian Empire, the superpower that had conquered Egypt and Babylon and stretched from India to the Mediterranean, had been stopped. Not just stopped, but pushed back, humiliated, forced to watch as its army was destroyed and its fleet burned by a coalition of Greek city-states that should have been easy prey. The Battle of Mycale was the final offensive act of the Greco-Persian Wars, the moment when the Greeks stopped defending and started conquering. It liberated the Ionians, secured the Aegean, and opened the door for the Athenian Empire and the Golden Age that would follow. But it also planted the seeds for the conflicts that would tear Greece apart in the generations to come. The victory that saved Greek civilization also set it on a path toward self-destruction, a reminder that even the greatest triumphs carry within them the potential for tragedy. For the men who stood on that beach at Mycale watching the Persian fleet burn, none of this future tragedy mattered. They had lived through the darkest moment of their civilization, had seen their cities destroyed and their temples burned, had stood at the edge of oblivion and pushed back. They had fought alongside men from cities they had hated just years before, had forged a unity of purpose that transcended the petty rivalries and grudges that normally defined Greek politics. They had proven that free men, fighting for their homes and their families and their freedom, were stronger than the enslaved soldiers of an empire. And they had won. The story of the Battle of Mycale is a story about revenge and liberation, about the brutality of ancient warfare and the courage of men who refuse to accept defeat. It's a story about betrayal, as the Ionians turned on their Persians, masters in the midst of battle. It's a story about the limits of empire, about how even the mightiest power can be brought down when it overextends itself and underestimates its enemies. And it's a story about legacy, about how a single day of battle on a beach in Asia Minor helped shape the course of Western civilization for the next 2,000 years. The Greeks would tell stories about Mycale for generations. They would sing songs about the burning of the fleet, about the bravery of the hoplites who stormed the fortifications, about the rumour that spread through the army promising victory. They would build monuments to commemorate the fallen and dedicate temples to the gods who had given them victory, and they would remember that on one perfect day in the summer of 479 BC, everything had gone right. 2 battles, fought hundreds of miles apart by armies that had no way to communicate, had both been won on the same day. It was the kind of coincidence that seemed too perfect to be real, the kind of story that made men believe in divine intervention and fate. Whether the gods actually intervened at Mycale is a question for theologians and philosophers, but the facts are undeniable. The Persian fleet was destroyed, the Persian army was annihilated, the Ionians were liberated, and Greece was saved. That is the legacy of the Battle of Mycale. That is the story that history remembers. The day the Greeks stopped running and started fighting back. The day Sparta took its final revenge. The day an empire's fleet burned on the shores of Asia Minor, while free men stood and watched and knew that they had changed the world. If this deep dive into one of history's most brutal and decisive battles has left you wanting more, then you need to join our community on Patreon. There, you get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes content, exclusive documentaries that never make it to YouTube, and direct input into what battles and wars we cover next. The link is in the description. Your support makes these deep historical investigations possible, and helps us continue bringing you the brutal truth of warfare throughout history. This has been Wars in History. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Until next time, remember, history is written by the victors, but we tell the stories of everyone who bled.